Hello and welcome to All Four Wins Football. I'm proud of myself once again because I didn't just kick straight in with the intro and I'm keeping with the brand, which is great news. Tonight, we settle the age-old adage. In the red, white and blue corner, internationals, countries, patriotism and pride, the pinnacle of sport. In the blue and white stripe corner, clubs, the bread and butter, the platform indeed to rise to international football. Who's going to be the winner? Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back once again. It's All for Women's Football. You've noticed we've all grown larger. It's bigger. And that's because, basically, putting it simply, Mia and Megan couldn't be bothered. And Connor is off doing his quiff. So, it doesn't get that stiff and up like it needs to be without a little bit of tender loving care. So good luck to those three. But instead, we have still got three of the usual crew. We're still here with Jess and Laura. Obviously, I'm here in the chair once again. And you excused me. Absolutely no problems whatsoever. You're excused. And we have brought in somebody else. Somebody may have said it was an upgrade. I'm not my words. But we have got Polly in the corner as well. Polly, lovely to have you with us today. So, are we all right, gang? Laura, you all right over there?
Yeah, I'm good. Had a nice weekend away, so back and refreshed.
Nice weekends away. I've just had half term. I spent one day at school and all of a sudden I feel like I've been there 7 weeks again. So it's amazing how quickly that happens. Jess, lovely to have you back here. How are you doing?
I am good, thank you. I said just before the show, I think I'm getting a cough. So if you see me like coughing up a lung in the background somewhere, just don't even worry about it. It's fine.
I mean, if you cough up a lung, I feel like we probably are going to have to call 111 at the very least.
That'll be fine.
It's not generally what we do. And Polly, lovely to have you. I think first time on the channel properly. Welcome, and how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. I've been frolicking in Florence, so I've got a bit of post-holiday blues, but no, very happy to be here.
Excellent, and we are pleased to have you here too. Hello to everybody in the comments already. Lots of you popping in and saying hello. And that's fine. You can unsubscribe if you want me, just as long as you're back here next week. And yes, a new face on the show has Mia got jet lagged from our trip to it. I mean, it's possible. It's possible. Stranger things have happened. So we want to have a chat today. I thought we could have just had a chat about the internationals and how all that was going. But then I thought, I think it'd be a really good idea if we really got into this club versus country. And I'm not just talking about, should people be going off to play internationals or should they be concentrating more on their clubs? I'm talking about the whole shebang. Is there too much of one, too much of the other? So we're going to get properly into it. So Jess, I'm going to kick off with you purely because you are in that position where we generally tend to start with people. So unlucky you. And what I want to talk about, first of all, the risk of being Lionesses FC. It's the England versus Spain match that's just happened. Not the nuts and bolts of it, but whether or not we felt like this was an international that was worth doing. I read a piece by Tom Gary, which I really thought was quite interesting. It's this idea of the fact that we've travelled all the way to Spain for this warm weather international and this warm weather camp. We've played a game in Spain in front of less than 1,000 people. Austria have had to come all the way over there, play a game in less than 1,000 people. We're talking about a team that made it to the quarterfinals of the Euros, a team that's made it to the finals of the World Cup and won the Euros. And here we are in the middle of Austria playing a game in front of 1,000 people when we sell out at home. If you go to Wembley, you're getting 70,000 people. Serena Wiegman spoke about it being an interesting thing for her to do and a good thing for the squad. I want to know what you think. Is it worth us doing this? Is it worth us travelling over to other countries? It's not like when you've got your clubs and they go off and they do these tours to try and raise the profile of it. This is an international club. I mean, do the people in Spain really care? Unless they are expats, they've gone living out there pre-Brexit, I would imagine. So what's going on? Is it worth doing that, Jess? What did you reckon?
I personally don't particularly mind it. I think they obviously sell it as like the whole warm weather training thing. And quite honestly, with the weather we've had here, I would not turn down a chance to pop over to Spain for a couple of weeks. I do understand it is a bit silly, like like you say, we're playing a game against like 1,000 people. Whereas here you think, yeah, that might kind of sell out, or, you know, it might pull in a good crowd. But for me, I think it's a good chance to like rotate through the squad. It's a friendly. It gets people out, basically training in a new environment. You know, some of these girls will have seen nothing but, well, I mean, it actually chucked it down for the whole game from what I recall. But in terms of like the training, when you see the training videos, you know, they're all actually in like shorts and a t-shirt, which I'm incredibly jealous about. And I think, having played football myself and always doing sport in winter, like your risk of injury is just a lot higher. So I think from that perspective, it is a good idea. And it's across all different sports. People go abroad for kind of winter training camps, basically, to remind themselves what sun actually is. And of course, for other teams, not really England, but for other teams, it's good sometimes for like acclimatise. You know, there's international tournaments, things like that. Teams will go and play in sunnier climates to get themselves ready and just acclimatise to the weather. But yeah, I think it just mixes things up. I think it's good. I think it's good for the players rather than being a kind of better for spectators. I think it's good for the players, in my opinion.
I think that's a reasonable point. JJ saying Serena probably meant it was good for team building for the youngins to have a go and a volleyball type thing than it would be to see her in a Parker looking like South Park's Kenny and just sort of wondering, you know, what on earth is going on. So I get that. But the other side of this was that Tom Gary was talking about was like the carbon footprint. The fact that two teams are about to travel from two different countries to go to this completely neutral country just for the sake of playing a game of football. Does that have any impact on your thoughts on these sorts of things?
Yeah, definitely, because I can very much see both sides of it. I think in some ways it is a really good thing, particularly with integrating the under-23s into the senior side. I think that's really positive. However, the climate impact, when football is currently got targets it needs to meet and trying to be net zero and all this sort of thing, flying, in fact, well, 3 squads in this case. You've got the under-23s, the senior lionesses and the Austria side, and then the Italy side will be out there as well. Having that doesn't quite make sense to me. I think also because it is in such a hard location to access, it's not as if travelling fans can really turn up. Of course, it was announced about 2 weeks before the actual game as well. So that adds, I mean, even if it was announced a month before, I think it would have still been pretty impossible for a lot of England fans to get there because flights to Gibraltar are ridiculous. Flights to Malaga, I mean, I guess it's possible, but the ground is also in the middle of nowhere. I actually looked at it to do it and it was feasible, but it would be very, very difficult. And so you're isolating a lot of fans. And I even saw a tweet, I think he was replying to Tom Gary's article from a guy who lived in Spain and was like, I wouldn't have been able to do it. And he lives in the country that this game is being hosted in. And then when you go back to the climate thing, if you want fans to come all that way, again, that's bad for the planet. So there are a number of problems with it, and I can completely understand why it's good for team building and integrating players. And I think the concept of having friendlies is fantastic. I really like it, particularly before a big cycle. So now we're going into the Euro cycle. I think that's really important that Serena gets to see the under-23s because she'll stick around till 2027. So some of these players, and a lot of these players, I'd imagine, will come up into her senior side. But at the same time, I think that can also be done at St George's Park. I mean, it's not as glamorous. It's a lot colder. But at the same time, it did also, as Jess said, bucket it down during the game. So don't know how like warm weather, summer weather is. It's emulating an English summer rather than a Spanish summer, in my opinion.
Seems fair enough. And Laura, the same sort of question to you. The thing that's been sort of brought up here is this idea that actually people can't get to it. And if that's one of the things, maybe that's part of the reason, you know, actually by going there and having less people, it's not going to be such a big deal. There's not as much pressure because there's not as many fans cheering on. It's a different type of environment. But equally, you're talking about not having the fans there. It then comes down to how that looks on the TV. And what was absolutely crazy is that the one that sold out in front of 71,000 people gets whacked onto ITV4 with absolutely nothing much, being no fanfare, nothing like that. And then this one in front of 1,000 people with thousands of empty seats because people haven't got there is whacked onto primetime TV at 7:45 at night on ITV, which again paints this picture that women's football isn't growing and that people aren't going to go and watch the games. Whereas actually, if you were to put the one that's filled up at Wembley Stadium, that shows that the women's game is growing and that you can still get the same atmosphere and all of that sort of stuff. So again, is that a bit of an own goal? If I understand them putting it on the TV, but surely whack that one onto ITV4 and put the sellouts onto the proper channels.
Yeah, I mean, I think my initial take on the not having that many fans there was actually it could be a positive for the team to have less pressure, because I do think with the Lionesses kind of getting the sellout matches at Wembley all the time, if you're playing at Wembley in front of a sellout, you're never going to treat that like a friendly. Like, I just think mentally, if you have all those fans, they're probably all Lionesses fans if it's at Wembley. Maybe like a small corner who you can't really hear of Austrian fans, Austrian ultras, I don't know. But like predominantly it's going to be England fans who's out there and they all want to see a win because that's what they've paid money to buy those tickets for. If you take them to Spain where the pressure's off, there's not many fans, then you can experiment, then you can have a friendly, and it will be a friendly in the sense that a friendly is a time to experiment where players are given more freedoms to do things they might not normally do in a match that might be kind of a tournament match, which I think you would emulate more if you were doing it at Wembley. Like, even if it wasn't a tournament match and that pressure's slightly off, you're still going to want to win in the same way. So I think that in that sense, it was really good. It was really positive to have less at the crowd. But then, like you say, you put it on ITV, and it's like, I don't know, like I think from an internal women's football perspective, I didn't even think about that because I knew what the friendly was. I knew what the occasion was. I wouldn't necessarily expect England men to sell out if they were playing a friendly against San Marino away, you know? So I don't think, from my perspective, but will that then be clipped up and shown on some random TikTok somewhere? Maybe. But do I care about the people that are making those random TikToks? No. So I don't think it's necessarily like a massive own goal. But I think the problem more is that original 71,000 wasn't put on ITV1. The fact that the Lionesses matches that aren't even that important, that are these warm weather friendlies, are being put on ITV1. Let's just celebrate that, the fact that even when they're not that big a match, they're being put on ITV1. So I can see it as positive, but what I do agree with is the kind of climate impact this could probably have. Like, I don't know what the solution is, because you want warm weather and Austria and England can't provide that, but can you at least play a country that's in a warm country? I don't know. Could you play Spain?
Yeah, very interesting. I like that. And of course, Mia Sladen here, loving that as well. She's going to like that, by the way. I think she's going to be sitting there chuckling into her snot, which is lovely. No, what a view. What a thought. This is what you get when you come to these sort of award-winning places. It's amazing. Given the crazy schedule these past seasons have had, I don't blame the opponent for not giving 100% every minute of a friendly. And that's kind of where I wanted to go to. See, look at that. I really did. I know her so well. The kind of point that I wanted to move to now is this. So Emily's put here, not going to lie though, sometimes I feel like we have too many international breaks. It can make the domestic season feel very stop-start. What do you all think? And I just wrote down some of the things that we stop football for. Obviously, we have the end of season breaks, and I understand those. But we've got the Olympics, we've got the Euros, we've got the World Cup, we've got the Nations League, we've got friendlies, and of course, who can forget the most amazing trophy that can ever possibly be won in the history of international football, the Arnold Clark Cup. Now, you can see just like, yeah, squad, the Arnold Clark Cup. It's right up there with the Carabao Cup. It's a lot. It's a lot that we're breaking for. I didn't quite do as much research as I should have done on this particular one, but I feel like there's probably more international breaks for the women than there is for the men. And this, I think, is part of the issue. It's almost as if they're trying to make it that the women are playing all year round effectively, and that the only players that are not getting that opportunity to play are the ones that are injured or the ones that are not deemed suitable to be playing in an international tournament. So I want to ask that question. We'll kick off with Polly on this one. Do you think there are too many internationals? Do we need to sort of cut back? Do you think it's a good thing because it gives the opportunity for more people? The friendlies, as we've just said, really pleased that Serena used that to start experimenting with the side, putting May Letizia at right backs. You know, it was an interesting idea. Putting Grace Clinton on there with Ella Toone as well and changing around the positions was really quite a good experimental situation for them. But is it worth it? All of these things. Obviously, you're going to get the Euros and the World Cup, but the fact they're thinking of, you know, they've done the Nations League now instead of just doing friendlies. It's like they're trying to emulate a lot of what the men do, but actually, it's a lot of football.
I'm going to give a really annoying answer of yes and no, but I'll justify it. So I think on one hand, there are way too many internationals. I think particularly where they fit in the year, it makes, for example, the WSL very stop-start. I know other leagues, it affects them differently because other leagues have different schedules and some are summer, some are winter. But I also think it really depends on who you are as a player. So for example, Georgia Stanway, she is at Bayern Munich, will start pretty much every game. She'll start every game for England. She'll have Champions League football. She'll have the domestic trophies in Germany. So she's playing a lot of football. But then say you look at a player who plays for Uzbekistan, who plays domestic football in Finland, I don't know. They will not play as much football as Georgia Stanway. So they will want more international, more domestic. So you kind of can't find a solution where every player has the same and every player has that balance, because at the end of the day, some players, the better you are, the more trophies you're entered into, the more competitions, you're going to have more football. And if you're lower down in tiers in different domestic leagues, your country is not ranked as high, then naturally you're going to have less games of football. And that's really difficult to solve unless you create more competitions for lower down or less competitions for higher up, but you don't really want to get rid of trophies in that kind of the top level. So it's a really, really difficult balance to strike. And I was Danielle van der Donk did an interview, I think, with a Dutch newspaper recently, and she basically said, like, I don't see a break in the schedule. She looked at her year, potentially she's going to the Olympics as well. She's got Champions League football. Where's her break? And that break is non-existent. But then so many other players are crying out for more football. You look at people in even like below the championship, I doubt many of them play international football, but you never know. They're crying out for more football. So how on earth do you suit everyone's needs? And it's interesting I know obviously an ACL injury is very, very multifaceted, but one of the things that's talked about is workload. And a lot of the outcry over when a lot of players were doing the ACL, it was kind of like last season, this was the main topic where people were saying, all these top players, you say, well, there's a reason it's the top players, because all these top players are playing a lot of football. But you look at lower down and I did pick very random countries first that came to my head, but lower down, people don't get those opportunities to play as much. So I don't have a solution, to be honest, but I think there needs to be a bit more communication between club and country to kind of balance that out to fit each individual player. And I know, of course, international managers want to play their best 11, particularly in competitive games I don't quite understand why they've got the Nations League. I'm not a huge fan. They're competitive games. You can't put out kind of your B team. But at the same time, for example, club coaches will be crying out for these players to be withdrawn, and we don't want to send them out. We've seen Emma Hayes, for example, Ramirez hasn't gone to the Gold Cup and things like that. So I think that the communication just needs to be better, because I do not think there's a perfect solution, because every footballer is an individual and has individual needs. That was very long-winded, but I think I articulated what I wanted to say.
I mean, certainly the answer to the question was in there somewhere, so well done. That was very good. Laura, same sort of things. I've done a rough little bit of research. From June to June, the men have 6 international breaks since 2023. So that was June 2023. They've got more coming in March and June. The women obviously had the World Cup in July. They then had a friendly in August, September. They had October. They had December. They've got them now in February, and I will be absolutely gobsmacked if there isn't at least one more before the end of WSL, which puts them on to 7. So they are getting that little bit more. And again, the WSL, as we all saw, didn't even start before they'd done that. So they had a break for the World Cup. They had a little bit of a break and then went straight back to international football before being able to have the opportunity to finally go back to the WSL, which for me just seemed absolutely crazy that you would interrupt a club calendar in that respect. I get there might be different for other countries. It's not all about England. I do get that. But I'm English, so my issue is with the English league, not with what's going on in the Norwegian Tippelagen or something like that. So for you, where do we stand on the number of games that are being played? Because again, Polly's come up with some great points there. Again, thinking more about the international schedule and how that works there. But from our point of view in England, how do you feel that ranks?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I think it's interesting how you put it in terms of the comparison to the men. I mean, I think there's two kind of points to make on that it makes that, like, you could say it makes sense that the women potentially have more from an English perspective because the WSL is made up of 12 teams, and so they're going to have less matches domestically than the Premier League, who have 20 teams, and obviously Championship and below have 24. So that's going to be more matches in a season for them. So in that respect, maybe from like a domestic English perspective, it makes sense that the women would have more breaks because they have more time in that schedule, and the season would be very short if we weren't to have the kind of breaks, albeit we have the winter break. So that kind of weighs out on that. But then you look at it the other way, and we also saw a lot of the discourse around ACL injuries being, well, this is a problem of this generation because they weren't given that S&C. Women weren't given the investment when they were coming through the youth ranks because the youth ranks weren't really there when this generation of players were in. It was kind of coming in. Maybe we're starting to see a generation of players who have gone through that. But the men that are in the game now and the women that are in the game now, if you look at the S&C they with strength and conditioning they've received going through the youth ranks, it's going to be so incomparable. Sorry, I'm not really even reading the comments as they come up, so if I'm meant to respond to any of them, apologies. But I'm sure we can come back to them. So yeah, if we look at the kind of strength and conditioning they've received as we go through the levels, the men are going to receive so much more and prepared them so much more for this kind of workload that it feels ridiculous that the women are having more football in that sense, like more international breaks, more continuous football. And I think it's kind of a symptom of the fact that the women's calendar still feels like it's being trialed and got used to. And I think in some respects, we're just seeing it across all sports at the moment because it is this financial thing. And I'm sure Polly can probably talk more about this. The cricket calendar is definitely having a problem with just complete overload of stuff. But like, I think it's potentially just the society and the desire for kind of televised sports competitions with increasingly different like stations and TV channels to televise sport on. They all want a share of it. So there needs more competitions to do that. And it's just taking it out on the athletes, and still until we kind of have some kind of resolution of we need to prioritize athletes ahead of money. And we've spoken about this in past shows with fans too, like television versus timings for matches. It's always television winning out at the moment. I think that's really the root of these problems, that television always wins out and the burden's on everyone else to kind of pander to that.
Yes, television is the root of all evil, is what I'm hearing there. Could well be the case indeed. So, I mean, some interesting points being made again. Trebuchet asking how much the national team compare to club salary. Now, I feel like I read somewhere that the women are now getting equal pay in internationals for England. Did I read that somewhere, or have I been dreaming? Good. So I did hear that. So whatever the men are getting for internationals, women will get the same thing. So in that respect, mega bucks for these people, the amount of times they're playing. So they're going to be able to afford that villa that they're staying at in Spain very, very soon at that rate. And Jess, I mean, this is a point. JJ saying there is a huge loyalty to watch every game for women's international sides, whereas the men's play sides like North Macedonia and a lot of male fans won't bother. I mean, don't even think you need to specify the male. I think just a lot of fans won't bother. I don't really care. When I watch the men play, it's usually because it's the World Cup or the Euros. If they're playing in the Nations League, it doesn't even register on me. I'm just like, I don't care, whatever, get on with it. It's not a problem. If there's a friendly, I don't care, whatever. Unless there's something riding on it, I genuinely don't care when it comes to England men. But I sat there and watched that friendly against England quite happily, having it on. And I don't know why. Can you explain why it is that we all seem still more invested in what's going on internationally than at club level?
I don't know if it's because since the Euros win, obviously that brought in kind of a whole new wave of fans, and not only a new wave of fans, but even people who were maybe more casual viewers, or who have sort of been around the game but sort of haven't really watched for a number of years. I think it really kind of solidified their viewership. I think also just the fact that they actually won something, I think that probably did a lot. In my entire life, the men have never won anything. So I think some of it is just that, got to a Euros final, won the Euros final, then a World Cup final. I think there's a lot more kind of love and appreciation for the current group of players. I think the men's team I think it was probably the 2018 World Cup, I think people did get a little bit more into the men's team again because they did well. But I think the kind of golden generation that I sort of remember from when I was a teenager, they should have been fantastic and they were actually just useless because they all hated each other. And I think a lot of people probably fell out of love with international football around that time because, let's face it, more or less my entire life, men's football internationally has just been one big disappointment. Every 2 years, just disappointment. So I think seeing the women do so well, obviously winning and then coming second in the World Cup, I think that has made everyone think like, oh, damn, England are actually okay, So I think there is just a lot more of a desire maybe to watch these games because you're right. I wouldn't, if I was at home and the men were playing in some friendly, I might throw it on, but I wouldn't be that invested. Whereas it was the same on Friday. I'd been out with my friend for the day and she was like, oh, do you want to stay round and watch football? And I'm like, yes, great, okay. Whereas if that was the men, I'd have been like, no, I'm just going to go home. So I don't know whether it just brings in more people. I think it's just united the country a little bit more. And like I said, I don't know if that's because the men haven't won anything. I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's just maybe got a bigger fan base at the minute.
No, absolutely. And I think the part for me here, again, it pops on to what Mia's saying here, is that where managers have to choose wiser for friendly matches. And maybe, it depends. When you say wiser, what do you mean? Is it one of those where is it wiser to pick players from, I don't know, from Brighton and from Bristol City so that it gives them international experience and you get to see what they're like? But then equally, you're risking people from those teams that might need them for relegation battles or, to finish as high as they can. Like whichever way you look at it, you are still risking people. I wanted to briefly ask you all about the Olympics because I've had a bee in my bonnet ever since this happened, and not just because Great Britain didn't go through. Far be it from me to get political, but when there was this big argument about Scotland wanting to leave United Kingdom, I got quite upset about that because my granddad was Scottish and I very much have Scottish blood within me. I've got English blood within me. I don't know any Welsh, but I quite like you sing beautifully. So I'm quite happy with the United Kingdom as it is. And I love the fact specifically for Great Britain that we're in a situation where we perform in the Olympics in the manner that we do. But I also listen very clearly when I hear people saying that Scotland and England, they're very different places. Westminster's in England, everything's England-centric. So I was quite annoyed to see that Great Britain only had the opportunity of qualifying for the Olympics based on what England did. And I know there's lots of people going, yeah, well, England's the highest ranked team out of the three. If it was Wales, then we'd be going for them. And maybe that's true. I don't know. But that's the argument that seems to be going on. Do you think there's a better way? Should there not just be a qualification for the Olympics, like a pre-qualification, where actually you have to pick a Great Britain side, and whoever it is that's going to lead them in the Olympics has the opportunity to do that? because it just seems to be incredibly unfair that players like Kirsty Hansen, for example, Hayley Ladd, I know I've just picked ex-Man United players, but the first two that came to mind, you have to forgive me for that, but they're not going to get the chance to play in the Olympics, and they could quite rightly be going back to Manchester United, not Kirsty Hansen, obviously, because she's not allowed in anymore, but they could go back quite easily. And, I'm surprised Hayley Ladd hasn't had a punch up with Ella Toon going, you've cost me a chance to play some football. So is there a better way? I'm going to open it up to anyone. Is there a better way for teams to qualify for the Olympics rather than just relying on one club? And I know that we're in a very unique situation like that, but what do we reckon? Because that has wound me up for a while. Don't all shout at once. That would be atrocious.
I think I actually agree with Sean here in that it probably just shouldn't be a thing. I think if we can't agree to have we either compete as different nations, or we compete always as Team GB, which will not happen. You can't make that happen. I don't think it ever really used to happen until the 2012 Olympics, when they were like, right, we're hosting, so we're having a team. And then from then on, I think it's kind of been like this, God, do we put up with it? And maybe the women will put up with it, but it's not really ideal. And it feels like it would be exceptionalism if we did have a kind of tournament just for Team GB to fit the qualification. But then at the same time, it's like, because I feel like we're the only ones that have this problem. So it would be a bit strange to just make up a tournament solely to fix that problem from a global perspective. From a Team GB perspective, obviously, I think, if you want a Team GB, it would make more sense to have a kind of separate qualification. But I think politically, it's probably more sensible to just be like, you know what, we can't sort out our own kind of nation situation. We're just going to have to sit this one out. But then I do agree that it's like, if we have a Team GB, surely that should be able to encompass all sports in some regards. I just think the sense of national identity takes on a different form when it comes to football.
I mean, I don't want to be this person, Sean, but I don't feel like I can allow this level of misinformation to be spread across the internet. We like to check our facts here. And of course, as you well know, as a proud Welshman, Great Britain is, of course, 3 countries: England, Scotland, and Wales. Northern Ireland is not. That's why it's Great Britain and Northern Ireland. That would be the United Kingdom, which is not a part of the Olympics. So for the benefit of our Northern Irish viewers who are frantically screaming at the screen here, of course, Great Britain is 3 countries. I'm sorry, Sean. I can't allow it. Sorry. I do make the rules. It's entirely my fault. I agree with you. I mean, again, with what Laura said, that kind of makes sense. But equally, the Olympics, this is what I mean. The Olympics shouldn't have had anything to do with UEFA. It shouldn't have had anything to do with the Nations League. It shouldn't have anything to do with that, because they're separate. The Olympics are the Olympics, and they should have their own qualifying procedure, because there is no England in the Olympics. If it was the Commonwealth Games, there's an England. It's not. The rules for the Olympics is that there's a Great British side. So surely that's, for me, like Jess and Polly, it's got to be a case of you look at it a different way. Whether it should exist or not is a different thing. It's either we don't put a side out and we just say, do you know what, we're not interested in this stuff. If Scotland and Wales want to prove how good they are, perhaps they can go in. I don't know what they call themselves, the Super Celts or something like that, maybe. They could go off and do that. But that's kind of got to be the way, hasn't it?
Ooh, do you want to go? I don't mind.
I will go. Okay. I've actually changed my mind, since I first thought about this. When England basically when Team GB weren't going to the Olympics, I was like, well, it's not really fair on the other teams. However, I don't really see another way of kind of doing it. If we're sticking with Team GB as a concept, which I don't mind, because I don't know, I don't really have a problem with it. I don't really see that there's another option. Are we really saying that Scotland or Northern Ireland, Scotland or Wales, thanks Barry, Scotland or Wales had a better chance of qualifying? Realistically, didn't we batter Scotland in this whole process to get to this point? I think if we're keeping Team GB as a concept, and I think getting rid of Team GB is just a whole other issue that isn't anything to do with football, it's an Olympic problem. I don't see that there's a better way. There was a comment a little bit further up, which I am going to try and find. Bear with. No, I've lost it. But basically, it was just saying that how many like attempts do we want to have? Here we go. There we go.
That one?
Yes, that is the exact one. Unfortunately, that comment is very true. And unfortunately for Scotland and Wales, as the higher ranking team, we were in the only position to qualify. And unfortunately, this time we did not. Now, you can argue that Scotland and Wales should have been given a chance. However, I agree with the comment below, so I don't think they should. And even if they were, would they actually have done any better? I just think, again, comments have mentioned it before, Olympic football is just a bit stupid, and I'm inclined to agree with that. I will also say that not that many teams as a whole actually qualify for the Olympics. I think from UEFA, so from Europe, there's like 3 countries, and one of them is already secured because that's France, because they're hosting. So whilst I think it's looked at as something really bad that England didn't qualify, or Team GB didn't qualify, I think we also need to remember the kind of bigger picture that in tournament football and in such a short kind of space of time, you only have to mess up almost on a couple of games, and that's it, like your qualifications out the window. It just takes a few mistakes. And we've said this before about tournament football, like a few mistakes and that's it, tournament's over. And that's kind of just an issue with internationals. Unfortunately, it's just one of them. Europe is stacked with some fantastic teams. They really are. If you look at the teams that are still able to go through, I think it's Germany, France is still there for some reason. I think Netherlands and Spain, they are fantastic teams. Really, really high quality teams. It's going to be one of them, obviously, and you can't say that they don't necessarily deserve to be there. So for me, whilst it's annoying as hell, I'm actually just quite glad that all the girls are getting a well-deserved summer off, to be honest.
No, I didn't. If you'd like to tell me more about it, maybe one of you lot did, then feel free. And we're at it again. Never fear, the wanderer returns. Yes, everybody's wondering where you've gone, Connor. But maybe one day you'll tell us. So there we go. Polly, you was going to say something before Jess rudely interrupted you.
Yeah, well, I mean, my shirt says something. But then the other thing I was going to say, so I'm actually going to the Olympics to see women's football. So I can't ever be like anti women's football at the Olympics, because I actually think it's a really nice idea. I love the Olympics, and I think I'll be interested to see or hear what the players say, because I know, for example, like Lauren Hemp went and got the Olympic rings tattooed after Tokyo, and like it's a really nice thing for them to be able to go to the Olympics. And Kim Little's been part of Scotland. She's been part of Team GB before, and was Sophie Ingle I think Sophie Ingle was in the Team GB squad as well. And it is a really cool opportunity and very different for these players because they never get to be part of a multi-sport event. And I know this is like different, but the Commonwealth Games, I know a lot of different athletes from sports, for example, like cricket, where they never compete at multi-sport events. It's so cool for them to be part of like a whole country identity, and they're not just representing their sport, they're representing their entire nation. I think that's quite cool. Obviously, it does get a bit more complicated and political with Team GB and that sort of thing. And I think the qualification system is very flawed. I've said it before, I'm not a big fan of the Nations League. And I think particularly because obviously I know it's not fair if England, Scotland and Wales all can kind of get qualification, and that gives them 3 opportunities. But I think also the way the groups, I mean, the fact England and Scotland were in the same group in the first place, to me, is a little bit mad, because that is a conflict of interest for Scotland players. And I don't think that's right at all. So that's a whole kind of separate issue. But I think it is a very complicated solution. I think there just needs to be a decision. Are we going to be part of the Olympics or not? And if we are, we need to solve this ASAP, because it is a very bizarre scenario, and it's very rare because I don't think any other country has it. I could be wrong. But it is a very, very niche scenario. And I think it's frustrating because, again, as I say, I think it's a really good opportunity. But I think the fact also, going back to the international windows and stuff, the fact the Nation League had so much on it, that is a bit of a problem. Like, I just think do it based on rankings. Don't have this whole knockout thing and extra competition, which makes it a lot more difficult. Just have Olympic qualification throughout everything based on maybe World Cups, Euros, all that sort of thing. I don't exactly know the logistics of how that would work, but having an extra qualification process, which is so flawed, does not make sense to me at all.
No, I think I agree with pretty much everything you just said there. And I mean, one of the suggestions that's come through as well is about the under-23s. And I do sort of wonder if maybe having an under-23s type thing for the women might actually be a good thing. We're talking about pathways to get these youngsters into matches. If it was actually to have them at a youth level, I think that would be quite an interesting way of doing that and getting people to play these bigger matches against perhaps more talented players across the world. So yeah, maybe that is an idea. So with that in mind, we get the chance to move on to, as we start to bridge the gap now between country and club, is this one. So Erling said the biggest problem with the internationals are players coming back injured. Norway sending back both Hegerberg and Caroline Graham Hansen back to their clubs now with injuries. Pretty sure Lyon and Barca are not happy. I suppose it goes the other way around. Sometimes you're a player like Leah Williamson, for example, and you end up missing all of the joys that you could have had. So it does kind of work both ways. But I want to look at this more on the effect on clubs, because I briefly alluded to it for us in the WSL, how mad it was that they went off to do the World Cup, went back to their clubs, had a little bit of time training, then had to go back off to go to international duty before coming back, and then having maybe a week or two before the season started. It just seemed like the weirdest way to start a season that I've ever seen. I've never heard of that before. How do we think these internationals, and I'll start with you for this one, Laura, how do we think internationals are affecting clubs? Are we in a situation where the balance is right, basically?
I think it's really hard to tell at the moment. Like, we need the ever said phrase, we need more research, but we've got so many injuries at the moment. Like, where is it coming from? Is it from overplaying? Probably is a factor. And I think potentially it's more coming from kind of the points that Polly touched on earlier in terms of that communication. If there was greater communication, then these issues wouldn't be happening as much. And it almost feels as like you can't predict a lot of, I think, ACL is going to come up, but I don't think you can necessarily predict exactly when they're going to happen. You know, Sam Kerr's, she's played like a huge period of games, and then it comes after the winter break. So loading and that wise, I don't think you can necessarily predict them. It feels like if you've had a large period of build up and kind of loading, even if you've had a break from that, it can still happen. So I don't think we're necessarily like, this is definitely, we can pinpoint the international break on this. But I do think, obviously, we're seeing increased injuries. We're seeing so many injuries at the moment. You're going to be changing systems. You're going to be going through different routines, perhaps, and consistency and keeping scheduling similar is obviously going to be more sustainable for a player in terms of what you're doing, your body, the environments you're in. The traveling is going to play a role in all of that. So I think we can definitely say, to some extent, there is obviously going to be a cost to playing internationals. But I don't think any player would say they'd want to swap that, because I think when we look at it from a fan perspective and we're supporting a team and a club, you're obviously, if Leah Williamson was to go off and had played for England and done it on her hamstring there, I would have been really personally annoyed, obviously, because I've lost one of my best players for my club. But would Leah Williamson have traded getting to play for England? Probably not. Like, that is probably the epitome of her career, of many players' careers, to go off and play for their country, because that is such a rewarding moment. So I think we can sit here from a fan perspective and kind of say, well, yeah, I'd like less of this, or this is clearly the problem. But I think until we kind of know where those problems are directly coming from, and I think to an extent, what maybe we hear a little too often is that it is a byproduct of the game. Injuries do happen in sport. And I think to an extent that probably is true.
Holly, straight over to you.
Yeah, I think for me, the big kind of problem, and Sean actually put this in the comment about like no player would refuse to play for their national team. And I think that is a problem in the sense that, say, players do have a conflict of interest if their club manager has been like, we don't want you to go to your national team. But actually, if they refuse to go to international duty, for example, with England, is Serena going to call them up again? Is Serena going to be like, oh, you're really reliable. We want you back. We want you in our squad again? Because actually, I know players aren't saying, oh, I never want to play for my country again. But if they're closing that door, I don't know how interested national team managers will be. And particularly for young players, if their goal is to play for...
Because this keeps going through my head. You get the bit about Spain, for example. You think about, obviously, those reasons for it. I'm not saying they just chose not to. But some of them had to turn up. Again, am I right about saying that? People had to turn up. If they were called up, so they had to be there. If they didn't, then there'd be a problem. So actually, is it some of it also the case that they can't refuse whether they want to or not?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about the rules to do with that. I think clubs can deny players going, but I don't know about individuals. I'm not sure because I know with like the whole Leah Galton situation, she's said no to an international call up, but that hasn't like banned her for being picked. But I know with Spain, if they didn't go, then they could have faced sanctions and be banned for like 3 years or something. So it probably works differently with different countries. But I think the players need to kind of be protected in that sense, particularly when they're younger, because if they get a call up, but actually their club really needs them. For example, you mentioned if like a Brighton player got called up, they're in a relegation battle and the Brighton manager doesn't want them to go. That's a real difficult situation for them to be in because of course they want to please their club and they want to do well for their club, but it's a huge opportunity to get called up for your country. And if you're kind of having to say no to that, I imagine that's a really horrible situation to be in. So I think the communication I know Serena is quite good at communicating with clubs, but all national team managers need to be really good at communicating with all the clubs on each individual player because they're not just managing a football team with tactics, they're managing people. And I think as professionalism increases, the managing people side does get a little bit abandoned. So I think ultimately that is one of the big kind of problems with injury, that communication of, oh, actually this player is not really fit to go to international duty, or giving those updates, because ultimately the club they don't own the players, but they are kind of the biggest stakeholder in the player. So I think that is the point, that the communication needs to be better, and the responsibility shouldn't be on the individual player. It should be between management staff and that sort of thing.
I just didn't read it. There we go.
It took me a while to get my little mouse across the screen to the unmute button. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that we have got, I think it's like just a series of events. We've got a backlog. Obviously, we should have had the Euros in 21, didn't have it till 22. So then we went straight from that, obviously, into a season, then into the World Cup. And then for everyone going to the Olympics, that is going to be happening this summer. So I think there is a backlog because of that. And I think also, in addition, one of the reasons we've probably seen all these international games is because the demand is actually kind of there now, especially probably from an England point of view. You know, we sold out Wembley for the Euros final. And then from that, I mean, I went down a couple of months later for the game against the USA, which again was absolute sellout. The Finalissima sellout. And basically every game now is just being so heavily kind of advertised, which is fantastic. But again, I think it goes back into like how we're loading these players. And I think a lot of it isn't necessarily even the loading, it's the lack of break from one tournament into the next international window. Like I think so the World Cup ended and I'm pretty sure some of the players had like 2 weeks off and then they're back in training, or they're back meeting their teams for pre-season friendlies. Then they're going on an international break. Then we're straight into the season. And I think it is just too much. we talk a lot now with ACLs and talk about prehab and how important it is to kind of prehab. Well, that's great, but a lot of these players are fully developed now. In some ways, like, it's too late for them. We've mentioned it before, how like the S&C hasn't been there. It's there now, but like, I grew up playing academy football. I'm 27. Anyone my age is not going to have had any of that. We just got through on a wing and a prayer. I wouldn't have even known what a muscle is. Like, well, I don't know. So I think that again, going back to what we said before, the next generation should hopefully be in a much better position. And I think there just needs to be more communication with the current batch of players, because we've got some incredible players. And injuries will happen. ACLs will happen. ACLs happen at any level. ACLs happen outside of football. My cousin did a ACL horse riding. So, even happens in that weird sport. But I think that the load that these players have now is just kind of insane. And it is just one of the downsides of the game becoming so popular. And I don't really know what the solution for that is. You obviously can't cancel these international tournaments because they've been in place for years and years and years. So I think, again, having better communication with the players, and a lot of that will come behind the scenes. So having better like gym regimes, having better kind of like sports psychologists, so they're feeling like mentally better and mentally like not fatigued. Because that's another huge thing that can play a part in injuries, that I think gets overlooked quite a lot. So I think, well, I hope that moving forward we can be in a better position. It's just that I do worry with the sudden increase in popularity, which on the one hand is absolutely fantastic and it's all I've ever wanted, like my whole life, for the game. I just think that needs to come with like a bit of caution. These players need to be protected because they are real humans. And we often talk as well about longevity in the game. We can't have longevity if like half the England team, for example, are off because they're all injured from overuse or, overtraining, that kind of thing. So that's why I said before about the Olympics hopefully being a good summer off for like the England girls, for example, because they've not had a break now for a few years. And I think we kind of forget how important it is for them to actually go and have like a normal life for a few weeks, because going on like a 2-week holiday and then going straight back into a training camp and then another training camp, then another training camp, like it's a lot, it's intense. And I think the players do just need a bit more of a break between games.
Absolutely. I think there's some really valid points there from absolutely everybody with regards to the internationals and the balance. We can have this discussion for you. Hands up, who thinks Wales are going to win the World Cup? There you go. Discussed. Motion carried. There's about as much chance of England winning up on the next show with a full head of hair. So that's where I'm going with that one. Right, we move into the club side of it now, because we've spoken about the effect on the clubs and we've spoken about these injuries, and the injuries obviously impact the international teams, but they impact the clubs, you could argue, even more, because they're the ones that have to, more often than not, foot the bill for them to be rehabbed and to get them back. They've still got to pay their wages, because you can't just go, oh, well, that's unlucky, we're not going to pay you anymore. It doesn't work like that. So we're in a situation now where we're talking about the clubs, and I just believe the WSL is too small. I mean, I can't get on board with this 12 teams. Even lower down we have it, and it's mental. When the fixtures came out for our games in Tier 5, it was all due to finish in March. Like next week was effectively supposed to be the last game. And I'm like, how can anything finish in March? That's like ridiculous. We should be going on until at least May. That's absolutely mad. As it is, we are going to end up going to May, because there's a little thing called the British weather. And that absolutely throws a few hurdles in the way. But it does, I think, need expanding. But I'm intrigued to see what you guys think about that. Do you think that the WSL needs expanding? I've thought about maybe things like merging with a championship. That's been floated at times as well. What do you think? Does the WSL need expanding? Should there be a bit of promotion happening to it, whereby we promote 2 teams one season, so we end up with 14 there? But then how would that work with the championships? And that's only got 10. What do you do with that? It does a lot to the pyramid. Polly, I think we'll start with you on this one. What do you reckon? Is there anything that we could do to get more games, or is that actually part of the problem? Because I fear that things like the European fixtures could eventually get to a point where they try and put more of those in, and then as a result, you end up with more football for 2 or 3 teams, if you're lucky, in the WSL, and the rest of us are all just sitting here twiddling our thumbs or playing in the Conti Cup, which is wonderful. So what do you reckon, Polly?
I think the WSL definitely does need to be expanded. I think it will have to be gradual purely because of levels of professionalism. I think if you merge the Championship and the WSL straight away, like at once all together, it would end horrendously. There would be huge score lines. There are, of course, amazing teams in the Championship, and you just look at the title race at the moment, and there are potentially 4 or 5 teams that could come up, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. But even the gap within the Championship between the top and the bottom teams is huge. The gap in the WSL between the top and the bottom teams at times is huge. You get score lines of 7-0, 8-0, 9-0. So already that is a problem. So I think the expansion would have to be gradual, but I also think expansion is necessary. Obviously, in terms of, we've just spoken about international scheduling and it's already too busy. But I think actually perhaps that's the way to calm down some of the internationals, is expanding these leagues, and fundamentally having a strong domestic league is the best way, I think, for you to get better as a nation. Of course, players play abroad and stuff, but if you have a strong domestic structure, that's only going to help your national team. It's going to help the standard in international football. So I would say start off with going to 14, then 16, then 18, and adding 2 every year until maybe you get a league of 24 or whatever. But that also does rely on tiers in the second and third tier becoming professional. And I understand that the Championship is a lot better than it was. There are teams, for example, Newcastle in the third tier. Controversial where the money's coming from, but they are professional. And so you need more of that. And that comes with investment. And that relies on the men's teams being willing to put money into the women's teams. And unfortunately, a lot of men's teams are not willing to do that at the moment. My personal view is if you are a men's team in the top 2 tiers, you need to have a women's team, full stop. Like, otherwise, you shouldn't be allowed in the top 2 tiers of men's football, because you're not a football club, you're a men's football club. And I don't think that's right. But that's kind of besides the point. I think investment's really important. But if you are going to expand, you have to make that playing field a little bit more level, because otherwise it does get a bit ridiculous. And I know women's football has always been mocked for these massive score lines and stuff. And sometimes that's down to a team just having loads of good strikers. But at the same time, you want the league to be competitive. You want it to be entertaining. I think that's what the WSL is becoming. I don't think it's fully there, because it normally is a 2 or 3 horse race. I mean, last season it was a 4 horse race. But as I say, the disparity between the top of the WSL and the bottom is still quite big. But I think if you want to make it more competitive as well, you have to expand it, purely because I think it's the stat that no team has won the WSL by winning. Is it losing more than 2 or 3 games? Or so it was a stat like that. And actually that's a bit of a problem, because it makes it a little bit more predictable. I mean, I know it's still competitive, but you want teams to not have to be this kind of perfect outfit where they win every single game. You want teams to lose and other teams win and come up, and it makes it more exciting naturally. So it does need to be expanded, but I think we kind of have to be careful how we go about it, but also not forgetting below the top 2 tiers, because often tier 3, 4, 5 and onwards gets very abandoned. And actually, if you want to make the top 2 tiers really good, you have to have that development coming through below, so players can come through and teams can get promoted, relegated. I think it's a good start with the Championship that 2 teams are coming up, 2 teams are going down. That makes it more competitive. Have that in the WSL. Don't have one team go down, because then a lot of the time you get a yo-yo effect with teams coming up and down. So yeah, don't have a solution, but that's kind of my thoughts on it.
Well, I mean, it's an interesting one, isn't it, Jess? Because, I mean, one of the things I think I floated at points is we speak a lot, again, as I mentioned earlier, with the internationals, about development of the youth players at these high levels, because you get lots of youth teams, but, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, any of you, but there's very few footballers that play for a youth team say Man United, Arsenal, I would imagine, that then make it to the senior team. You don't see it that often. You see it a lot in the men's game. All these youngsters come through the academy and now they're getting a game. Might happen in pre-season friendlies, but because, as Polly's just mentioned, you can't afford to be losing these games. If you lose 2 or 3, you're probably not going to win the league. So therefore, how can you rest your laurels and your opportunities on these players that are untested? It's too much of a gamble. So I wondered, Jess, if throwing some of these youth teams or reserve teams, for want of a better term, into, say, like the Championship or Tier 3, might actually be a way to bolster, first of all, the number of teams that are there that you know aren't going to go bang, which is really important, because you don't just want loads of teams in the top level and then they all have to leave the pitch effectively. But would that be something that you would get behind if you were able to have, like I say, these reserve teams able to play, which then gives potentially better quality matches being played at that level, and hopefully would bring through some of the youth players so they're more likely to be ready to go into first team football maybe the following season or something like that?
Sorry, despite the fact I was literally waiting for you to finish talking, I'm having issues with the mute button today. I don't know what the problem is. I'm just going to blame it on the fact that it's a Monday night and I'm just easily confused. But we got there in the end. I actually quite like that idea. I think we spoke about it last week or the week before, because I think it's the German league do a similar thing. I don't know if their women's league do it, but I know the Bundesliga do. And I think with the reserve teams or the B teams and the 23 teams, whatever you want to call them, they basically, even if they win the league, they don't go up. They just sort of stay there, I think. And I actually quite like that concept, because I feel like the players that are playing in that league or in that team, for example, if we use Man United, because I'm a United fan, say that Man United development team go into tier 3, tier 4, whatever you want to call it. Those players in that team are ideally not wanting to stay in that team. They're wanting to push on and progress. So I don't really have an issue with them forever being in that league, if that makes sense. Because ideally, after a season or two, all of those players are going to have moved on, hopefully, anyway. And I think it will help to sort of bridge the gap between under-21s, under-23s and first-team football. I think when people say get the academy players on the bench, I think they kind of forget what a big step up it is from being like a 16, 17-year-old to suddenly playing on a pitch with, 21 other grown women. Imagine being 16 years old and getting absolutely body slammed by Millie Bright. You have got to protect your players. So I think whilst it's easy to say, yes, these players are fantastic, and they are all fantastic academy players. They've not got there just by luck. They are all going to be very high quality, and they're going to be pushing for that first team. But you can't just throw them in willy-nilly because Bob down the road thinks that they should have a chance. And I think having any kind of setup that can bridge the gap and, put players against, older women who have been in the game for a long time, it gives them more experience, it gives them more opportunity. And I do think that could be, a good idea to look at. And I think it would help, like we've kind of talked about, expanding leagues. Because like we've said, you have got to be careful with how you expand the league. And whilst I think that it would be a fantastic idea to expand WSL up to, in the future, 20 teams, I think like Polly said before, two teams a season. I think any more than that, and it's going to get stupid, because you don't want kind of ridiculous scorelines. That's not going to benefit either the winning team or the losing team. And like Barry, you mentioned, in the tiers lower down, whilst there may only be 10 other teams in the league, that season is going to go on forever, because the pitches will be waterlogged, and then they will freeze, and then they will be waterlogged again, and then they will freeze again. And before you know it, it's May, and you're having to play 4 games in a week. So I think at lower levels, it has to be. I would love a bigger league at lower levels, but I just don't think, with the way we run our seasons, it is at all feasible, because games just get cancelled constantly. But at the top end of the pyramid, tiers 1 to 3, maybe even 4, they should be, and this is the other thing, they should be playing on good enough pitches that can survive our winters. You know, it's not a shock every year when suddenly it starts absolutely lashing it down. You know, we should all be used to it now. And yet every year it's like, wow, it's waterlogged again. What a shock. So I think that's, again, where investment comes into it. It's not just investing in the teams and investing in players. It's investing in infrastructure as a whole. It's investing in pitches. It's investing in changing rooms. And it's just making the game more professional from kind of the ground up almost. You know, I'm not saying that like Sunday League specialists needs to be playing in a full kitted out stadium. But the top kind of few tiers should be having sort of better infrastructure behind them. And I think that will just help the game and the tiers just improve and grow.
I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because we've got Luton at the moment, and they do play on a normal, proper football pitch. As a result, a lot of their games get called off, and they are, I think, 5 or 6 games behind everybody else in the league at the moment. And potentially they could be up there challenging Real Bedford for the title, but Real Bedford are sitting there at the moment, you know, like 15, 16 points clear of them, if not 19 points clear of them, without a care in the world, because they're just looking at them going, well, they haven't played those games yet, and the rate is going, like you say, they're going to be playing them all in 1 week in May at that rate. Laura, throwing it over to you. Same question, but are we just in a situation where actually we all want this? We want an expansion of the WSL. We want these top leagues to have more, but that actually it's just a case of we're in a society where we want everything now, and that actually we're just wanting it now, but actually you've got to grow the game. Are we in a situation where it's a bit like having a child and wishing they were at secondary school already? Ultimately, you can't just do that. You've just got to wait until they get to that age. Have we got to learn to walk before we can run?
I think there's an element of that. I think, yeah, we can't just stick the championship, which is kind of said, we can't just stick the championship and the WSL together, which I think is the kind of, I want it now. I want this 24 league or 20 league. I want to match the Premier League immediately. And it's just, yeah, it doesn't work like that. But I don't think at this stage it feels unreasonable to say, okay, we'll take 2 teams from the championship, because like, if you're looking at that table, what is going to be the difference between first and second in the championship coming up this season? Probably not a lot. I think maybe the bigger challenge will be, are the financial checks in place? Like, should there be not just a footballing kind of criteria to get into the WSL, but should there be a financial criteria? And is that a bad thing? I don't know. Like, surely you want the best quality football, but if you're going to make the game sustainable, you want teams that are going to be sustainable in the top leagues. Ideally, you'd be able to have infrastructure in place that would mean even if they were in that situation, there'd be some form of bailout, because even if you're in the top division for quite a while, i.e. Reading, there's no guarantee they're going to stay. So, and kind of be safe. But I think you can definitely kind of mitigate against that by having like a financial check. And I don't think that's like, oh, this is just the women's game. You know, things like that happen in the men's game. To get promoted to the league, you need certain stadium requirements. You need various financial checks as well. So I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to say, you know what, if we're going to move away from this just 1 up, 1 down model, and we're going to go 2 up, 1 down, let's put in some financial checks for that second team. And if not, let's just not relegate anyone from the WSL if those teams don't do it. And whilst that's kind of like, oh, it loses that competitiveness, because we all love a relegation battle, you know, there's still the potential that they are going down. You still get that relegation battle. And in the end, if they don't go down because the team below doesn't meet the financial checks, you're actually getting a more sustainable game. And you should then put in help the next season for that team that missed out on those financial checks to be like, right, what do we need to do to support you to meet that criteria? The kind of, I think where we're hitting the like, are we going to like, what is it, like fly before we can walk or whatever? I don't know if that's a saying or if I just made that up. But run, yeah, that's it. Well, you know, I went even 1 step ahead and went fly.
I mean, to be fair, if you're learning to fly before you can walk, you are one impressive human being, Laura. I'm going to give you that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm close to the flying pot. But yeah, if we're doing that, then I've really lost my train of thought. I'm just thinking about how I could fly now. But yeah, if we're going for the kind of the model as in like this NUCO thing, I think we can. I'm sure there'll be shows further down the line where we're discussing issues around that. But I think that's potentially where we're most likely to run into those problems of running before we can walk, in terms of some of the things that they maybe want to bring in and just in the kind of profitability model of women's football, because that feels like guaranteed what they're going to bring in is how much money can we make from all of this as soon as possible, because they're run like a company. So I think that's where we'll hit those problems probably soonest. But at the moment, I think it's entirely reasonable to say let's expand by a little bit. And obviously I want that to see that staggered down the division. So let's bring up more from tier 3 and do it that way. And I think there is that kind of push. I don't think that's unreasonable to say let's do more than 1 or 2 there, because they're competitive too. And we're seeing even Newcastle getting beaten by the likes of Forest. So let's do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. And I think Trebuchet coming up with this idea of relegation, promotion, playoffs. I mean, maybe that's the thing. Do you put 3 up from the Championship, but one of them's got to have a playoff with the team that finishes bottom in the WSL, and if that person or if that team wins it in the WSL, then they get to stay, and the other one's got to stay in the Championship, or they swap places. It's an interesting way of doing it. My final question then, because we've looked at the internationals, we've looked at the clubs at the top end, but I also worry that there's a danger that the money that's getting pumped into the women's game has got the potential to end up doing exactly what's happened in the men's game, which is where all of the wealth is being put around the WSL and the Championship, and the rest of the leagues just end up having to sit there with their little begging bowl out, asking for any little bits of extra cash that's flowing about and anybody's cast-offs effectively. So my last question for you, and you all alluded to it a little bit, is about how we can ensure that grassroots football, particularly within the women's game as well, is maintained and kept. Now, obviously, I'm talking again from really low down regionalised, so I've got no idea what it's like in the Northeast Regional Women's Football League or anything like that. But I look at what's going on in the Eastern region, for example. In the Premier League, we've got 12 teams. We've maintained 12 teams, no problem whatsoever. But just one division below us, in Division 1 North, we've had 2 teams drop out already this season. In Division 1 South, I think 3 teams have dropped out. So you've got 1 league of 9, 1 league of 10. You get this happening quite a bit. There are clubs that just don't want to bankroll women's teams anymore and just think it's not worth it. We're not gaining anything out of this, so they don't bother. How do we get to a point where we are strengthening those teams? Because otherwise, effectively, we could be in a situation where there was obviously all this talk in the men's game about the European Super League. If it carries on like this, you're going to end up with just a sort of a women's Super League, effectively, even though there is still football outside of that. So, Jess, you've played at the lower reaches, so I kind of want to ask you first on that one. And I didn't say that to be derogatory about your playing skill. I'm saying you played for a team that plays in the lower leagues. What do you think needs to happen for football to remain positive at that level and also competitive and enjoyable, so that we do have teams that can realise that dream, like Wimbledon of old in the men's game, where they made it all the way through the divisions into the Premier League and then into an FA Cup final? What do we need to do to ensure that stays, that same dream is there for little girls all throughout the rest of time?
Oh, I feel like this is something I could just rant about until the end of time, because while
because we're getting a bit late, so maybe 5 minutes.
Just yell at me if I start going on. But yeah, I feel like we've said, and we say it all the time, the Euros, and just as time's gone on, women's football has improved massively. But one thing I will say is at the lower levels, nothing much has really changed. Like the team that I used to play for, I think in previous times, they've been in the league above, they've dropped back down. Some of it is just the area that I live in. People tend to move off. We get a lot of like younger girls coming through, but then they hit 18 and they're going to go off to uni. So they're going to go from here, like Manchester, Liverpool, or further afield. So as soon as you kind of get any good young players, they're gone. So it just becomes quite difficult to keep people. So I think in terms of the people who are in areas like I am, which is just a moderately sized town, I think it's just getting more players in. So from a younger age. The other really dumb thing, to be honest, is the town that I live in isn't massive, but we now have 2 women's teams. So the team that I was playing for now basically have a local rival in the exact same town, which great, but also we don't even have the players for the team that I used to play. And I've probably not helped anything by leaving, so soz guys. But I think things like that, you know, growing up, we were always supposed to have partnerships with the men's clubs. And no, we really did not. We had partnerships when it suited. And when I say when it suited, I mean when it suited the men, basically. When they could turn around and say, oh, yes, look, we have a women's team. Look at what we do for women. Look at us. We're amazing. But the reality is I've had all sorts of issues. In a team that I used to play in, we ended up having to go to the club because we were basically left without a manager. And the club, they're just not interested. They've got a women's team because they kind of are forced by society to have one. And I think that's another thing that needs solving. We talked before about how, you know, all kind of, for me, all professional and semi-professional clubs should have a women's team that they also are going to invest in. And, you know, a lot of teams have kind of foundations and community outreach programs. It all should just kind of fall under the same sort of umbrella. You know, we talked before about the way the fixtures are, and with so many games getting called off. Like a few years ago, I literally did play 4 games in a week. I played on a Sunday, I played on a Wednesday, I played on a Friday, and then the Sunday again. And like, people work. So I was lucky in the fact that I could make all those games, but that meant that I played basically 4 lots of 90 minutes in a week. I can't do that. I have a full-time job and a life, which may come as a shock. But that was because all of a sudden the FA decided that they didn't want the games running past the end of April. So with like a few days' notice, we were just forced into these like 2 midweek friendlies, and then obviously our normal 2 games on a Sunday. And like, that's insane. We talk about player protection and things like that. You know, if the WSL players aren't even getting protected, people in lower leagues, like, not really interested. So I'm not gonna lie, I've sort of forgotten what the original question was, but basically got to continue to get more people into football from a younger age, which I do think with the new emergent talent pathways, they do look like a much improved system over what I experienced playing academy football when I was younger, which was pretty awful, to be honest. So I think that's a really good start. And then it's just like the men's teams, it shouldn't even be like a case of men's teams and women's teams. It should all be just a club. And like, people like to preach about this whole one club thing, but the reality is I think a lot of teams don't actually do what they say that they are doing or what they should be doing, if that makes sense. I think they like to talk big and look good, but I think more action needs to be taken.
Yeah, I mean, NT saying there, I got cramped last night in bed and it still hurts now. Playing that many games in that amount of time is insane. And to be fair, it did feel like you were coming up with a new Craig David song there. You know, played a game on Sunday, had done the one a few days later on Wednesday, then once again on Friday.
It really felt like that. There was less than 48 hours between the Friday night game and the Sunday game.
It's actually mad. It's a fair play for you. No wonder you don't play anymore. Legend has it that's why you stopped, and that you were 6 foot before that game. So, but there we go. Polly, I want to throw that over to you as well. But you mentioned about you thought that any team in the top 2 divisions of England shouldn't be in a position where they're not investing in their women's side, or at least have a women's side. Now, again, looking at the league that the Stevenage are in, you've got Luton are in that league. You know, that's a Premier League team, but their women's team are in Tier 5. Stevenage, which is obviously the one that I work with, were a League 1 side. You look at the likes of Lewis, we know that they have a very split model. You know, whatever money comes in is shared between the men and the women equally. But then I look at clubs like the bottom of our league, Kings Lynn Town, and they're like my heroes, if I'm brutally honest with you, because some of their players left. They've got hardly anybody left. They're playing effectively a youth team. They could have just given up. I spoke about people withdrawing from the league. They haven't done that. They've got 1 point all season. I think their goal difference at the moment is something like minus 120, and I'm not even exaggerating. Every game they go for must be one of the hardest things they ever do. They do it for the love of the game and to keep the club going. But that's not sustainable. You look at the attendances that come in some of these games, it might only be 100, 150 people, and the vast majority of those will probably be friends or family of the players that are there. What do we do to get that enjoyment at these lower levels where people feel on a Sunday they can go and support? Because I do understand, like, you look at Stevenage, if you're going off on Saturday to watch the men's team and you've got a family, that is very difficult for you to go out all day Saturday effectively to go and watch the men's football and then go out all day Sunday to go and watch the women's football. So are we in that sort of situation where sometimes people have got to pick and choose? Maybe if the women are at home and the men are away, there's more chance that people might go. Is it about fixture planning as much as anything else, do you think?
I think fixture planning is really key, and it's really interesting because, like, growing up, I don't think I ever watched non-league football. In fact, no, I went to Haleslow in town once, which would technically be like my local, but it's really difficult, I guess, to get people really, really interested because you've got these amazing stories, but they're all hidden. And I know a couple of weeks ago we've spoken about the magic of the FA Cup and how that brings people to their local club, which they've walked past it 100 times but don't really know anything about. And I think it's those provide amazing opportunities to get people interested, to get people invested in the players and that sort of thing. And so I think that's quite key, but it is really, really difficult to do. And I think, as you say, like, people are kind of like, oh, do I go see the men's or the women's, particularly if they're both at home on the same weekend. I totally get that. But I think actually a lot of the time the men's team might be away one week, the women at home. So you can kind of do both. I think I'll go back to the point I made before about if like a men's team, a professional, semi-professional, whatever, they should have a women's team. Nothing angers me more when I go on a club website and it says teams and you see the drop down of senior, under 21, under 19. It's all men's. There's an under 11 men's team, but there is no senior women's team. Like, it happened recently with Porto FC in Portugal. I went to see one of their games. There was no women's team. I couldn't find a women's team on their website, but they had an under 11 boys team. And I just thought that is absolutely ridiculous. And those boys will be treated so well. They'll probably have their tracksuits paid for. They'll have, I mean, obviously some of their games will get called off, but they'll have a lot better facilities and things like that than a lot of women's teams in the lower league. And that really does my head in because it make sense. It really doesn't make sense. So I think I don't really quite, again, don't know the solution myself, but I do think that it does come down to a bit of respect. Like, of course, put investment in, but I think having a bit of respect, and the stories I've heard from lower down where there's been no changing rooms, the women have been kicked off it's literally a field full of dog poo. They've been kicked off the field because some boys from down the road want to have a kickabout. It is absolutely ridiculous. And so making those small changes do go a long way. Obviously, there are way bigger problems, and getting people really interested in these sort of things, I think that's kind of a separate thing. It comes down, you have to have those small little changes and get the basics right before you go on to these much bigger issues.
I mean, there's some great stories. You can think about the club, who I'll make them remain nameless without trying to upset anybody. There was the club who were playing. They were about to kick off. The referees come out, done a ground inspection. Yeah, it's fine. We're going to play. They've gone out. And just as they're about to kick off, the groundsman's come out and gone, no, you're not playing on here. Not happening, and just called the game off. The groundsman, which I found absolutely amazing, because I'm pretty sure that's up to the referee to do that. But my personal favourite was the one where the girls turned up. Not my girls, again, not my team. They turned up to play a game of football and they couldn't because there was a bouncy castle. They were doing a big day, a fate type thing. And I kid you not, this bouncy castle was probably on like the corner flag. Everything else was off, but they'd put this bouncy castle effectively on the pitch just a little bit, so they couldn't play the game. So they had to go and play. They were lucky they had playing fields behind. I say they're lucky as if that's a delight, but like you say, they've got to go and play there where there's all dog poo and all that sort of stuff, or they would have had to forfeit the game. So you do get some really ridiculous ones. Laura, I want to ask you as the last person on this. It's about money for me. How do we get that money down? We've seen what's happening with the FA Cup, how we're getting better payouts. How do we get to a point? I've always argued that actually I don't think the men need to be paid anything to win the FA Cup. There's a big old prize pot there, but I cannot think for 1 minute. I mean, let's say they win £5-10 million. There's not a Premier League side that is dependent on £10 million that's going to win it. So, Man United, or I say Man United if they're likely to win anything lately, but, Arsenal, Liverpool, Man City, 10 million to them means absolutely nothing. If that was being pumped to the lower ends, I'm talking men and women here, we'd be in a position now, surely, where the game would get better because we'd be getting more investment in women's and lower league men's football as well. Do you think that's something that needs to happen, and how? How do we get that money to drip down to the lower league so that we are seeing more investment in grassroots football?
Yeah, I think absolutely that needs to happen. Like, if it's down to me, take every single penny of the men's kind of winning funds from a certain level upwards, like Premier League teams, and give it to the lower like the grassroots football, whether that's men's or women's, to be honest. Because I know you look at men's non-league and winning FA Cup matches, winning FA Trophy matches is huge, because what that money means to each club is huge. And that could, I think, we need to have that same kind of, I know, like the amount of money you can win by winning a lower, like a qualifying round FA Cup match in the men's game is like season changing for a men's non-league team, which is more than what women's teams at that level would get. So let's make that equal. Let's equalise all those funds, and we can take that from, like what you said, the winning prize for the FA Cup, because the likelihood is it's not going to be Maidstone United that gets there. But I think the concept of making sure every men's team invests in a women's equivalent is really interesting. I think until about 2 minutes ago, I was fully on board with it. But I've always had this kind of qualm of it in some way that feels strange, and I never knew what it was. And I think I've clicked on something in that if they didn't want to do it in the first place, and they're only doing it to tick a box because it's a compulsory thing, like how much more sustainable is it going to make it? Because it will feel like it will meet the minimum, and then that'll be it, because they never wanted to do it in the first place. So I think there needs to be, and I don't know how you solve that, because I think at the moment, do it, make them have a team, because it's better to make them invest something. And if the minimum requirements are investment, then it's going to be better than nothing. I do also think there's something in having a purely women's own team that is special, like a London City Lionesses, that we need to keep in the game. And it feels sad that it would just be kind of men's teams there and their women's teams that fill up the top divisions. So I have a problem with that as well, but I don't know how you solve that either. But I think there needs to be something like awareness in some way. Like, how do we create this? How do we tell more stories? I think the media have a role in this, but I don't think they do any at the moment. Like, where do the stories come from? They come from the women in the WSL. Let's start telling stories from Luton, from Kings Lynn. Like, I want to hear that story. I want that on the BBC website. And we've seen, like, I think Maidstone are a great example of this, that suddenly the BBC are pouring out stories that are great around men's non-league football. And they're way more interesting than anyone in the Premier League, because the Premier League players all live this sanitised life with loads of money. So let's tell the stories of Kingsland Town. Let's tell the stories of Luton and Stevenage and all these different teams, because they're going to have more interesting stories. They're going to... And that's what you connect with. You go, oh, I used to work where that person used to work. I want to go and support that team. Because I think the problem is that I support non-league football because my dad supported non-league football. But I don't support a lower league women's team because no one was supporting them because they didn't exist. I don't have that role model to follow. So we've got to create these new stories. And how do we do that? And I think it's just, I don't think, I can't see it happening. I can't see the media suddenly changing because they don't sell, those stories don't sell. But I think that's what we need to do. I don't know how we go about doing that, but I think that's what we need to do. Maybe channels like this, we're doing that.
We absolutely are all for women's football. It doesn't matter what your league, what your country, we will research it and work it out. And I think you're right. You spoke about the investiture and that idea. I mean, I always said it would be a good thing to put like a percentage on each club, what your income is, and that goes in. I see what you're saying. It's not necessarily sustainable, but people talk about the women's game should be self-sustaining. I totally agree it should be, but equally, if they're talking about where the women's team isn't making us any money, well, like you've just said in your chat there, Polly, neither of your boys under 11s. I mean, they're making absolutely nothing. That's all about investing for the future. And the idea should be that if they invest a bit now, they're going to have that little bit more money because the women will eventually get to a point where people do want to buy the product and are interested and are connecting with it. And as a result, therefore, the money will come from that. So sort of like speculating to accumulate, I think, on that one. And again, also with what you were saying about the fans and growing up through non-league football because your parents and that sort of thing, it's an amazing thing at the moment. We're sitting here and we are seeing it. We are seeing an increase in the top levels. We're seeing young girls and boys that are wanting to go and watch this football and get into it and enjoy seeing it. But I think the problem is that they're young. You've got to wait for them to get their own disposable income and their own families, so they're taking them to that. And then that's, again, it's a waiting game. It's a generation thing. It's not going to happen immediately. So I think it's going to be one of those interesting things. And it's been a brilliant conversation. I think we've nailed it brilliantly. So well done, all of you. Have we come up with an argument for club versus country? Have we solved the debate? Well, I think we kind of have. We're pretty clear that the money is there for the internationals. It's definitely where the interest is. And as you were saying about the media there, Laura, those stories sell because they're about Beth Mead, they're about Ella Toon, they're about Guru Wrighton. They're not the stories about the Vicky Neals, because not many people are interested in clicking on those sorts of things. They don't necessarily have that affinity, and they need to learn to have that relationship with these players. So if we solved it, I don't necessarily think that we've entirely solved it, but I think it's just like going on holiday, really, isn't it? I think it's one of those things where you have to go off and get on the internet and book yourself your holiday. You've got to go out to all the shops, buy your clothes that you're going to be wearing, make sure you've got all your outfits. You've got to make sure you've set the alarm, got the taxis. You've got to go through all that work, save your money, make sure you've got all you need. If you've got your luggage or your passports all set, you've got to go through all that palaver. You finally get yourself to the airport. You've got to be there 7 hours earlier just to make sure that nothing goes wrong. You finally get through customs, everything's okay. Then you realise you're not allowed to take your bottle of Coke through there because that's way too much liquid. So now you've got to buy a new one when you get across there. And finally, eventually they let you on the plane. And then you get to lie on a 4-poster bed and just play volleyball with your mates. And I kind of feel that's where club football is getting to. Is it at the point where it's going to overtake the country? Not yet at women's football, but is it gonna? You bet you. We'll see you next week, next Monday, when I can't remember who's in the chair, but hopefully whoever it is won't be sick and will be here. So good job, everybody, and we will see you next week.